So today we will have Klaus Roderick. I don't know if it's the right name, Klaus, but from Climate Action Network Europe, and he will look at the main takeaways of the EU ETS deal. And then we will have Chiara Conradi from Transport and Environment on the path for the new ETS2 and the role of the Social Climate Fund. And then we have a brief question and answers for the two speakers and a little bit of discussion. And finally, from the head of the consortium of the ETX project, Sam van den Plas from Carbon Market Watch will make some closing remarks. So let's start. Klaus, the floor is yours until 10:25.
Great, thank you very much, Francisco, and also good morning, everybody, and also thanks for Carbon Market Watch for organizing, and Zero, of course, for these talks. I will just share my screen, and also Francisco, if you tell me if I run a bit out of time, so I will try to hurry up. So welcome everybody. My name is Klaus. I work for Climate Action Network Europe, NGO coalition, and also Carbon Market Watch is a member of us. We're based in Brussels, and we've also collaborating closely, I think, with many of you on the revision of the ETS and also on the Fit for 55 package a bit more globally over the last years. And I will walk a bit through some of the main takeaways from the deal. As Francisco mentioned, we just had the deal before the holiday break. We now got also access to the final text. So yeah, I'm happy to share a couple of maybe main assessments on the kind of key pillars of the deal that was struck by the institutions on the emissions trading system. So, I mean, very quickly, just to look back, it has been quite a journey with the emissions trading system. So, you know, it was launched as part of the Fit for 55 package in the summer of 2021. And then we also had quite a bumpy ride when it came to the negotiations, specifically in the European Parliament, when after the Envy Committee vote, the first vote in plenary was rejected in June 2022, and we actually needed to go into a second trial to pass the plenary, which only happened after the summer in 2022. And then we saw the finalization of trilogues in the second semester of last year, with really clinching a deal, I think, in quite impressive, I have to say, on such a very complex file, and also in relation, of course, to other flanking files that were on the table and also discussed in trilogue, notably the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but also the social climate fund that Chiara will also talk about. So now we had the preliminary agreement among the negotiating teams in the trilogue negotiations before Christmas. And now the actual final formalization and adoption of the text, which is probably more of a formality, will happen this semester. So we're at the moment looking into the final text to be approved by the Council and then also by the European Parliament, probably at the plenary session in March. Just some impressions of all the work that I think also many of you have been involved in over the years. So it was also, of course, quite a journey in pushing for the NGO's priorities on influencing and improving the Commission's proposal, and also, of course, shaping the proposal in the first place. But I will give a quick overview on some of the pillars that were kind of the centers of Can Europe's position and priorities also on the file. They mainly kind of gravitate around these four topics. So one was increasing the overall ambition of the scheme in line with the Paris Agreement. Then a second one was about strengthening the resilience and the ability of the system to react to external shocks. Then the third one was actually implying rigorously the polluter pays principle across all the sectors covered by the ETS. And then the last pillar is about funding climate action, so really using the financial resources generated by the ETS for also to support the transition. And we knew already that the system that was in place really needed fixing. So we knew a lot of work was necessary to be done. So maybe just to start with some very headline takeaways, but I will go a bit more into detail on each of those, but only that you get an impression using a bit this kind of traffic light. So when we look back at the outcomes, we still have to say that for the overall ambition, we definitely see a missed chance. We definitely have some improvements, especially compared to the system as it is right now. But I think there was quite a missed chance of the legislators to actually go beyond what the Commission had put on the table and also what is needed in light of the climate crisis. Here, the ambition could have been increased much more. But we saw this already on the Parliament side that here a battle was kind of lost in the battle of the plenary, particularly. When we look at the resilience, the second pillar, it's maybe a bit more mixed, that we actually have quite some improvements, but also still a chance coming up for further improvements. Then on the third pillar, overall on the polluter pays principle, it's probably should be even a darker red. We have some positive signs, of course, that we will see the end of free allowances in the system, but overall there's still a lot of freebies for big polluting industry, and definitely more pressure also from civil society towards industry needed in the next years. And maybe the only pillar where we can give more or less a green light would be the funding pillar, as there were some significant improvements also to the way that money needs to be spent. But this is really just to give you a bird's eye view, and now I will dive a bit more into the detail. And please, collect your message, your questions, and we can also, of course, happy to address them after the presentation. So when we look a bit more into the details on the ambition side, we actually see that there was rather little difference between the positions of the institutions. So the final deal now slightly increases the target of emission reductions for the ETS by 2030 to -62%. This is quite a substantial increase from the current -43%, but it's only a marginal increase from what the Commission has actually put forward in its proposal, which was already 61%. Here we saw quite a battle, especially about one element, which was the rebasing of the cap. So basically adjusting the overall cap on allowances downward in order to better reflect the level of verified emissions. Here, the European Parliament particularly had quite a harmful position in the sense that they actually split the rebasing proposed by the European Commission into two phases, and therefore also worsening the impact on cumulative emissions. So ultimately, although there were different scenarios in the different institutions' positions, the actual impact in terms of the cumulative emissions, as you can see here, is quite similar. So we have the European Commission with cumulative emissions in the period of 2021 to 2030 being around 12,309 megatons, and the final deal is actually very, very close to that. So even if we have maybe a slight increase in the percentage number for 2030, the overall impact there is quite marginal. So what we can say overall is definitely a step forward to the current status quo. We will also see the cap of the ETS hitting zero in 2039, most likely. Definitely an improvement, of course, to the current status quo, but quite a missed chance of the European Parliament and the Council to actually push for something even more aligned with what we would consider 1.5 compatible. So this would also mean that the ETS actually does not contribute to the EU going beyond the net 55 overall 2030 targets, and the kind of additional ambition that we can maybe see is coming rather from the LULUCF regulation, but not from the ETS as such. Maybe one small item to mention here as well that made it into the final deal is that the Climate Scientific Advisory Board, the ESA-BCC, has also a role in providing further advice. They are also this year specifically in an exercise to scrutinize the EU's remaining greenhouse gas emission budget. So I think this is quite an interesting element as well, also for our work going forward, to maybe activate and see how the Climate Scientific Advice Body can also initiate maybe further or future improvements to the system. Then moving on to the second part, I will not go into all the technicalities here, but maybe just to say that there were definitely some improvements, particularly to the so-called Market Stability Reserve, which is this instrument that's main objective is to absorb allowances, surplus allowances that are in circulation in order to address the historic surplus of allowances that we have in the system, and that historically has dampened the carbon price significantly in the past. Here, the Commission's proposal was already relatively good. However, some options, especially in the Parliament position, which were quite positive, didn't make it into the final deal. So, for example, the Parliament also had suggestions to improve still the thresholds for the so-called intake rate of the Market Stability Reserve that would have led also to further or more amount of allowances in circulation to be absorbed into the reserve. Here, the thresholds proposed by the Commission were kept also in the final deal, and something that we have also pushed for, especially in the last chapters of the trilogue, was also about these thresholds to be reduced according or in line with the linear reduction factor and the overall decarbonization trajectory of the ETS. Something that was also in the Parliament's position, but unfortunately also the final deal still kept the wording of the Commission where these thresholds remain static. So that just means that there would have been potential to make the system even more responsive and possibly also a bit more resilient in our point of view. But there is a review coming up in 2026, so there is also another chance to actually still strengthen these elements. Maybe one thing also to mention here, the Parliament had quite a bad position on restricting market access. This didn't make it into the final deal, so this market access restriction was rejected. So here actually, yeah, also the Commission that didn't propose any changes made it through. Some changes were made to the so-called excessive price mechanism under 29A. So this was quite of concern also because of the context and the energy crisis, or energy price crisis currently, where the institutions felt that the rules to have some reaction also in case the carbon price increases in a very short time by a substantial amount, that there should be a mechanism in place that can react. So here they changed some of the parameters. So if the price now increases by 2.4 over a period of 6 months, then the Market Stability Reserve would release 75 million allowances back into the system. On one element, the so-called unilateral cancellation, that means member states have the chance or the option to cancel allowances unilaterally if they see, for example, coal power plants domestically closing down. There we were pushing for making this cancellation mandatory for member states. Here, the only addition was that there's a bit of a stronger message or language in the text. So now member states are strongly encouraged, but it still remains voluntary. So I think this is maybe still a good, maybe also, and also underused provision. I think that we need to bring also to the national level, saying that, for example, if we have countries going for a coal phase out, they should make use of this provision and notify the Commission that they will delete a share of their allowances at national level. Then moving ahead to the probably biggest political battle, which was about the free allowances in the system. I tried to find the darkest reds possible for this part. So although we see definitely now an end of free allowances, which is quite an historic win, I think, because it has been really one of the main problems of the ETS, as it meant that industry really didn't have incentives or were not really caught by the polluter pays principle. This is definitely a step forward, but the final outcome still is very late and very rather weak. So we'll only see a phase out of free allowances for those sectors that will be covered by the carbon border adjustment mechanism by 2034. And actually the bulk of free allowances will only be reduced after 2030. So more than 50% will only be reduced after 2030. And this still leaves us with nearly 5 billion free allowances given to industry over the entire trading period, which is just a massive support still for these highly polluting sectors, and quite at odds with the urgency and the speed that we actually need industrial transformation to be rolled out. Another element that was included by the Commission, which is this so-called conditionality element, kind of an attempt to better condition the receive of free allowances, made it through, although the council tried to really delete everything, but the final outcome is not very strong. So there's a possibility of reducing 20% of free allowances if companies do not implement energy audit recommendations. And then there's an additional condition for the 20% worst performers that need to put forward so-called climate neutrality plans. If they don't are not in line with their trajectories and targets of these plans, they might also see another reduction of 20%. Yeah, but it's 20% reduction is not very strong. The Parliament had definitely a stronger position here, but at least the conditionality somehow made it through. We have some slight improvements in the benchmark improvement rates. However, a massive exemption for the hot metal benchmark, which was quite, particularly pushed through by the steel sector and by Germany in the council. So yeah, only some marginal improvements here, but still we got an improvement also of the minimum benchmark improvement rates. Another issue that was raised also through the council was these additional free allowances for district heating under certain conditions. This is something we definitely have to monitor quite closely still in the implementation phase. Maybe very briefly on the international or on the transport sectors covered by the ETS1. Aviation, which was of course already covered. We had a big fight again over the inclusion of intercontinental flights, but here the final deal goes with the text of the Commission and the Council that for now only intra-EEA flights are included, while extra EEA flights will be covered by CORSIA, and there will be another review to include them possibly in the future if CORSIA is not delivering, which is very likely to be the case. There was a slight acceleration of the phase out of free allowances for aviation. So by 2026, all aviation operators will need to buy their allowances at auction. And there was a quite important inclusion also of the assessment and monitoring, reporting, and verification of non-CO2 effects in aviation. Then for shipping, here definitely a great step forward as the maritime sector gets included into the ETS. We have all domestic and then 50% of extra EEA voyages being included, and also quite a rapid phase out of free allowances for shipping, not as quickly as the Parliament requested, but still fast. And then coming to the final pillar, probably with the most positive pillar, at least here I put also the green lights, is on the ETS revenue. So here there was a big fight about actually making it mandatory for member states to use all their revenues for climate spending, which so far has only been optional for 50% of the revenues generated by member states. Something that was lost was an explicit target in the Parliament position of 10% to be used for public transport and 10% for support for least developed countries. However, there's stronger language now in the criteria, at least on the climate finance aspect, but there's no dedicated 10% target in the final deal. But definitely we have a big step forward in terms of the requirements on member states to use all the revenue for climate action. Transparency and reporting, this also relates still to us monitoring also the implementation of this deal. I think I need to come probably to a close. I'm just looking at Francisco. How many?
Yeah, you're fine, Klaus. Fine. We give you some tolerance because those tables are just excellent, and it makes sense for us to go through all the process, and then we have some flexibility at the end.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Also, of course, I'm aware it's maybe a lot of information, but let's focus maybe on the colorful parts. These are the final deals. Just maybe then briefly on the ETS funds, particularly the Modernization Fund. We have actually a top-up of the Modernization Fund, as also the Commission has proposed, so 2.5% additional pool of allowances will be used for kind of a second tier of a Modernization Fund. This one will be available for more member states than the Modernization Fund 1. And I see here, I think there's a slight mistake. So the final deal actually says that the beneficiaries of this extra tier for the Modernization Fund are countries below 75% of union average, because it now also includes Greece, Portugal, and Slovenia. This was the council position that made it into the final deal. On the spending criteria, however, there was quite a fierce battle still in trilogue, as particularly the beneficiary countries pushed very hard in the council to allow some leeway for fossil gas investments through the Modernization Fund. Here, actually, the Commission and the Parliament had been much stronger in really ruling out any fossil fuel investments. Right now, there's a possibility of fossil gas investments if they're compliant with the taxonomy criteria and if these investments are duly justified for reasons of ensuring energy security. So definitely also something that we need to carefully monitor. As well, when it comes to the priority investments that have a slightly stricter scrutiny also to rule out fossil fuel investments, we have a bit of a different approach. So the first tier still remains with the Commission's proposal of having 80% priority investments, but the second tier is a bit stricter with 90% of priority investments. Then just a quick word on the Innovation Fund. So the second fund created that we have under the ETS. that mainly allows for investments in industrial transformation and low carbon, zero carbon technology in industry sectors. Here we have an increase to the status quo, but we actually have quite a relatively low size or reduced size compared to the different positions of the institutions. This also relates to the fact that for some of the measures proposed under the Repower EU plan last year that needed financing, the political decision was to tap into parts of the Innovation Fund as well. So we have a slightly reduced fund size here. I think that is then the last slide, just on a couple of other issues on biomass. We still have the final deal talking about possibility of putting the emission factor to 0 for biomass if they comply with the sustainability criteria that are currently also negotiated under the Renewable Energies Directive. And we also have a bit of a blurry wording around the use of carbon capture and use. So we didn't get the disposal language in the text that the Parliament had pushed for, but some other obscure wording about normal activity taking place after the end of life of a product. So we also still have to monitor also the implementation of this in order to make sure that we don't get any we don't open kind of Pandora's box also with maybe with unsustainable CCU into the ETS. And then just maybe a last flanking issue, also the Repower EU bids that were discussed at the same time, where we actually now had a decision to tap into the Innovation Fund rather than the Market Stability Reserve releasing millions of allowances into the market that then would be auctioned off. And then a part also is used from allowances that otherwise would have been auctioned by member states. So this brings us a bit back to the bird's eye view again. I mean, this is a bit our assessment now. Like, we have the whole traffic light when it comes to the assessment, and then also, of course, when it comes to strategically, what do we take from this deal? There are maybe these 4 points. On the ambition, it's very clear that the final outcome is still not in line with the 1.5 target. So we actually, as a community, have to still maintain the pressure on the 2030 NDC. This is still remains insufficient with the Paris Agreement and with the EU's fair share. And we also have a discussion about 2040 and 2035 climate targets coming up this year. So it will be very important that we maintain the pressure on the EU's contribution to Paris. Then there's a big issue, and probably Chiara will also touch upon this, about the social imbalance, where we still have massive amounts of money being directed towards polluting industry, while support for low-income households actually remains relatively low compared to the amount of industry support. And then definitely some homework for us to do on the implementation, also on the reviews of implementing acts and delegated acts, but also on reporting, for example, of the revenue spending as part of the LECPs. And of course also on the issues related to biomass, CCU, so a lot of things where we really need to carefully watch the implementation side. And then maybe a bit broader is us as a community, there's a need to think about the future of the ETS also post 2030. We will see the cap hitting 0 before 2040. There's a big question about also the following architecture or climate policy architecture that is already starting, at least in the Commission already now. So I will leave it here. Thanks a lot, and happy to take questions after.
Thank you very much, Klaus. It was a 10-minute tolerance almost, but I think it was worth having it. And Questions and discussion will be after the next presentation by Chiara Corradi from Transport and Environment. So we'll go into a deeper dive into the new ETS2 and the role of the Social Climate Fund. Chiara.
Hello, Francisco, and hello, everyone. I will share my slides. Thank you for organizing this event and inviting me. So let's dive into these two files. I am Chiara Corradi. I work on as a climate policy officer, transport and environment, and based in Brussels. And I work on the EU climate tools that have a relevance for transport. So the effort sharing regulation, the ETS for road transport and buildings, also known as ETS2, and the Social Climate Fund. So the content of my presentation, first of all, I will give a little context. So why do we need an ETS2? What it was proposed? What is the outcome of the trilogues? We'll give a general assessment, but also go deep. I would consider in specifically some selected elements that would try to give a hint of what is the impact of the ETS2 and of the revenue spending. So why an ETS2? So actually the road transport and building sectors are already covered by the effort sharing regulation. So the regulation that sets national climate targets for the EU member states. So this means that actually under the ESR, the member states are the first responsible to adopt the sectoral regulation that cut emissions in these sectors. But then what happened in the last decade is that the emissions in these two sectors haven't decreased sufficiently. They have even increased between 2014 and 2019. That's why the ETS2 was introduced, because it is a backstop solution. It means that if member states don't do enough with sectoral regulations to cut emissions, then the ETS2 kicks in. And it actually, by delivering the necessary emission reductions, it helps the member states to achieve their national targets. So the benefits of the ETS2 is that it guarantees a cap on the emissions, and it contributes with the 45% of the additional emission cuts that we need in the two sectors by 2030. Without it, we have a 10% gap in the emission reductions, and these are the European Commission's data. A general assessment of the trilogue. So with adoptions of the text, we will have the polluter pays principle extended to road transport and building. So we put a price on pollution in these sectors. This will push the demand, the consumer's demand to clean solutions, while regulation push the supply of clean technologies and solutions. So the two instruments should be, the two kind of policy should be in synergy with each other. And then in the package, there's also attention for the social challenges, and that was the main point. The Social Climate Fund is created, so it's the first fund to address social climate issues related to climate policies. The Social Climate Fund will redistribute the revenues between and within the countries. And in the ETS2 designs, there are some safeguards that are meant to shield the citizens, such as the price cap and an emergency brake. So let's see what is the scope of the ETS2. It covers the emissions of the fossil fuel consumed for private and commercial uses. But in the trilogues, it was also extended to the heating used in industrial processes, so small and medium enterprises, not covered by the existing ETS. Member state can opt out of the ETS2 until 2030, only if they have a national carbon tax, which is higher than the ETS2 carbon price. But still, the Commission ensures that this opting out doesn't impact the Social Climate Fund budget, so that the emission quotas or allowances are still auctioned. And then another provision allows member states to opt in additional activities and to reap the revenues from the auctioning connected to the extension of the scope. The ETS2 will not enter into force immediately, but in 2027. This is 1 year after what the Commission has proposed. And the Social Climate Fund will kick in, will start in 2026. I see a question in the chat. I will quickly address it because the answer is quick. So what are the additional activities? It depends what the member states decides. We don't know yet. So the ETS2 starts in 2027, but there's a safeguard. It's called the emergency brake. So if the price, either the price of gas or the price of oil, exceed a threshold before the start of the ETS2, so in 2026, then the ETS2 start is postponed to 2028. This is good, it's a safeguard, but attention, because there's a trade-off, because it means that with the delay, the emissions quotas are not auctioned in 2027. So this has an impact on the Social Climate Fund. So there are in the Commission proposal already included some mechanism to avoid price shocks. So essentially, I will not get into the detail, but essentially, if the price doubles or is 3 times higher than the level of the past 6 months for a duration of 3 months, then there is a release of additional allowances. So more allowances are auctioned, and they should lower the price. This is good, but these mechanisms not always work, because let's say think about the case where the price increases significantly, but it doesn't double. Then in that case, the mechanism won't work. This is why it's positive the fact that co-legislators introduced a price cap. This is a set of 45 euros per ton of CO2 until 2030. What happens is that if the price is exceeded, then the cap is exceeded, then there's a release of allowances. And the Commission, for the period after 2030, we don't know if there will be a price cap, but the Commission can assess how the price cap has worked, can propose modifications, can propose to continue for after 2030. This is good, but it's not ideal from a technical point of view, because the price cap should have increase over time, for example, 10 euros per year, in order to account for inflation and deliver the necessary, ensure that the necessary emission cuts are delivered. Then another provision which is new is the fact that the regulated entities, which are the energy companies that must buy the emissions quotas, must report to the Commission what is the main average share of the carbon price that is passed on to the consumers. The objective of this provision is that the Commission should check that they don't pass on to the consumers a higher, a carbon cost higher than 100% of what they actually paid. So they don't reap windfall profits. The Commission, as a consequence, if the Commission finds malpractices, the Commission, it can propose legislation. So this is quite a weak provision, because it doesn't, for example, it doesn't require companies to absorb part of the carbon cost. Stronger rules, stronger provisions could have required that, and avoided that the citizens pay the full price, carbon price, if the carbon price is high. But again, it's good that this is balanced by the fact that there's a price cap now. How the ETS2 revenues are going to be used. So this is our estimations. Based on the fact that now the ETS2 will run from 2027 to 2032, not from 2026, so around 270 million euros. Part of the revenues will go into the Social Climate Fund, up to a maximum 65 billions, while the rest will go to the national budgets. But as also Klaus has mentioned, for the first time, the member states shall spend all of their revenues on climate action. So this is good. let's talk about the Social Climate Fund now. As said, is the first EU fund that addresses social issues linked with climate policies. And it redistributes the ETS2 revenues because the allocation key favorable, it's beneficial for low-income countries. And also we must consider that the wealthiest households and the wealthiest countries are those that consume more, so they pollute more, so they pay, they contribute more to the revenues actually. Oops. Where the revenues of the Social Climate Fund come from? So 150 million of the ETS2 allowances will go to the Social Climate Fund, but that was not the case in the Commission proposal. The Commission proposed to use them for the Innovation Fund, so for industry. This is not happening now, and it's good. Then 50 million allowances of the existing ETS will be used for the Social Climate Fund. This is also good because we must consider that district heating or electricity production is already covered by the ETS1. So actually the carbon price is already passed on to the consumers. And then the ETS2 revenues will be used to, on top of this two stream of revenues, to reach the ceiling of 65 billion euros. This is good. As Klaus said, it could have been bigger. Resources could have been more. I mean, and if we compare it to the free allowances and the support that is given to the industry, so the unbalance is still striking. To access the Social Climate Fund allocations, the member state must prepare some the social climate plans where they say what measures and investments they're planning. So what are they going to spend the money on? They have a timeline, objectives, and goal. They identify the benefits, the beneficiaries, and so on and so forth. And they must contribute with their own budgets to 25% of the estimated value of the plan. This 25% actually has been decreased compared to the Commission proposal. The Commission has proposed for 50% contribution. So if we take into account the member state co-financing, the total resources channeled to social and climate measures will be 81 billions. But if the ETS2 starts in 2028, for the reason that I said, so no actioning in 2027, this budget is lower, is 68 billion. But if we consider the shares, the Social Climate Fund will still correspond to 30% of the ETS2 revenues in both cases. The Social Climate Fund has the objective to support, to address the needs of the households, transport use, and micro enterprises that are vulnerable or particularly affected by the ETS2, especially those in energy poverty and transport poverty. One good thing is that for the first time, there's a definition on transport poverty in the EU law, which was not the case before, and this should provide guidance to member states to identify the beneficiaries. The fund can be spent for direct income support. This is important because investments necessitate a time lag before starting to produce their effects. But there's a ceiling, so the member state can use maximum 37% of the value of the plans on direct income support. That also guarantees that the rest of the revenues are used for structural investments, which is essential. And these investments, for example, can consist in increasing energy efficiency of the buildings, decarbonizing heating and cooling, integrate renewable energy sources in the buildings, improve access to zero and low emissions mobility and transport solutions. I see some questions on the chat, but maybe we will answer them later, right? Okay.
Yes.
So one important point is that there is no clear exemption of fossil fuel technology. So there's no clear provision that says that member state cannot spend their funds technologies that are, yes, efficient, but still fueled by fossil fuels. There's, in general, the measures and investments must respect some principles that do not significant harm, principles that must contribute to reduce fossil fuel dependency. It's a weak provision. And then the plan must be developed in member states by consulting local and regional level of government, stakeholders, civil society, and the representatives of the group, the vulnerable group that we receive the support. And they must also include in the plan a summary of this public consultation. Let's discuss briefly the impact. So this is the impact on at the EU level on the fossil fuel price. We see that the cost would increase by 11 or 10 cents per liter. I took the January oil prices. But what is the impact on the households? It depends on the households group. It depends on the income, the geography, the countries they're in, the households composition, the building ownership. And there are detailed studies that take this into account. They've been conducted a lot of studies. So I will not go into a detailed analysis here, but in general, I would say that, as said, the contributors are the wealthiest households, the wealthiest member states. They will pay more because they consume more. But then when we consider the impact will be felt relatively more by low-income households and member states because the expenditure, especially for heating and electricity, constitute a higher share of the income. This is why the Social Climate Fund is good, the fact that Social Climate Fund redistribute the revenues to ensure that it goes to those more impacted. But in order for this redistribution to then create the desired results, it's essential that member states carefully identify the impacted and beneficiaries. And in this case, in this respect, is essential the role also of the NGOs and the civil society in monitoring how then each member state does its own work. So implementation is key. And here again, for more information, WWF in 2022 in November, we had prepared an overview of the studies that look into the impact of the ETS2 and the design of the Social Climate Fund. So there are more detailed information there. There's the link in the slide, but I'm also happy to share it afterwards. Then what is the investment needs for road transport and buildings? Without accounting for the creation of the ETS2, the European Commission, so regardless of the fact that there's an ETS2, the European Commission says that until 2030, we will need 214 billion euros to decarbonize the transport and buildings, road transport and building sectors. And then there are other estimations. Housing Europe says that we need additional 13 billion to renovate the social housing sector. If we consider the Repower EU policy, we need additional 15 billion for energy saving residential buildings. But the bottom line is that there's a cost of the transition, and households will have to bear it anyway, even without an ETS2. The ETS2 raises the revenues. This is the silver lining, and it's true that the Social Climate Fund will not cover all of these investment needs, but the good thing is that it's there, and the objective is to ensure that the support is targeted and the money are channeled what is needed, and it complements the national resources. So the national budget doesn't substitute for them, but by doing this, the point is it could be bigger, as already said, because member states are required to co-finance only 25% and not 50% of the plans. But as I was saying, the Social Climate Fund is there, and that means that at the European level, all EU countries will have to streamline resources to address social and climate issues. So the tackling this challenge is not left to the fragmented action of member states. So I hope this I managed to give an overview and to make clearer and to give a clear overview of what's in the package, what are the implications, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Okay, Chiara, thank you very much. I think both presentations were excellent in terms of framing what is on the table. We already have a couple of questions in the chat. I believe for both of you, but particularly for Chiara. And I do have a small scheduling problem because I have another meeting, but Carolina from Zero will take over now, moderating the questions and answers during the next minutes until the final closing remarks by Sam. So Carolina, please go ahead.
Thank you, Francisco, and good morning to everyone. So we do have some questions in the chat. I think they are mostly directed to you, Chiara. The first one is, what is the starting price for ETS2 expected to be? And then would the social climate plans be part of the NECP's review or separate? You could start by just addressing those two, and then we move on, if you think. So
for the starting price of the ETS2, so initially the Commission had I made some estimations in the case the ETS2 started in 2026. Now it started in 2027. So take my information with carefully, but because it's based on estimation made on the base of a previous text, but the starting price would be around 35 euros in 2026. Now, if the ETS2 is postponed to 2028, then we can also expect a higher price, and in that case, we have the price cap kicking in. Then the social climate plans, they are not part of the same process of the NECP's review or drafting and final adoption, but they must be consistent with the NECPs. And the final draft, the social climate plans must be submitted by 30 of June 2025.
Thanks,
the guidelines, yeah.
I think that answers the questions quite well. There are a couple more. Yeah, and I think they are mostly directed at your presentation, Chiara. If you want to go through them.
Yeah, I will go through them.
Yeah.
So definition of vulnerable in the directive. Yes, there is a definition of vulnerable, who are the vulnerable households and transport user micro enterprises in the directive. The Commission will provide, so there are the templates of the social climate plans already in the social climate fund regulation. The Commission will provide common indicators and guidance on the social climate plans. So this is upcoming, I think this year, or to give time to member states to then elaborate the social climate plans, but we don't know, we have to see. There's no clear dates in this regulation. And the revenues of the ETS2 are not, so the social climate fund is not created through by making the revenues that go into the social climate fund owner revenues. For the moment, the social climate fund is established as externally assigned revenues, but with the possibility to include it in the EU budget when the next MFF will be negotiated.
I think the next one is for Klaus,
okay.
Actually. So Klaus, but you did already answer it in the chat. It was a question related to free allowances for the maritime industry. Yeah, and then I think there's also another question that can be addressed by both of you, either one of you. And it is if there is any indication of aligning the price between ETS 1 and ETS 2.
Yes, I can give it a start. Thanks, James. So for the moment, the way that the two systems are constructed, it's really that they're separate and adjacent. So that means they have their own EUAs, their own allowances, their own separate trajectories for cap development, their own market stability reserves. So for the moment, the way it is in the revised ETS directive, they are very separate. But we know from the European Commission, also from what we've also seen in their impact assessment and in actually the proposal, that there is definitely a strategy or a view for the post-2030 architecture that maybe these systems would be aligning. So yeah, I think for now, also until 2030, also because of the kind of price regulatory parameters that also Chiara mentioned under the ETS2, probably the prices will be still very different, and also the price developments in ETS1 and ETS2. Yeah, but it is possible that maybe in the setup for the proposals for post-2030, there might be initiatives to merge the systems, or at least to align the pricing more. That would be a bit my reading.
Thank you, Klaus. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but if anybody wants to come in and raise another question, feel free to do so. Oh, I see another one in the chat. Thank you, Andrew. How do you evaluate these measures in the context of an EU response to the Inflation Reduction Act coming from the US?
Yes.
Maybe Klaus?
Yes, thanks for this question. Yeah, maybe just to say, of course, this is a very hot topic also at the moment being debated. I mean, I think Europe has by default a very different approach to industry policy, also when it comes to, like, in comparison to the Inflation Reduction Act and the US approach. I think here the ETS does play now a bit of a more significant role than it has had until now, because we basically had a de facto exemption of the carbon price signal on the industry sectors for the moment. We will see a change in that now. I mean, that will, I think, be also a political signal of the end of free allowances. But the problem will be that that signal is possibly quite weak and maybe comes too late. As I mentioned, we will only see a reduction of 50% of free allowances by only after 2030. So I think and then maybe this is also coupled a bit with the investment needs and the investment gaps that we actually see in the industrial sectors that are needed for the transformation, especially of highly capital intensive sectors like steel, cement, etc. Where also the innovation funds was possibly not strong enough. So we already hear from the industry side very strong voices of replicating similar subsidy schemes in Europe. So I think the ETS can be a bit of a flanking framework, but it's quite weak. Probably from our community, we have to be very strong and vocal on the need of not just unleashing another wave of subsidies to industry, because actually industry will receive a lot of help still through the free allowances under the ETS. But we need to make sure that any kind of additional financial resources really go very well targeted into really transformational technology, circularity, demand side measures, also ways to reduce energy and resource efficiency, but also really push for energy savings. I think those are elements that are not very well reflected at the moment in the Commission's proposals and in government's discussions at the European Council level, for example. Yeah, and then of course something also that we need to still further push are more regulatory windows as well. We have the negotiations on the Industrial Emissions Directive, for example, or also on industrial standards that we probably have to elevate a bit more in this debate around the EU's response to IIA. Yeah, but maybe others want to come in as well on this.
Yeah, thanks, Klaus, for that interesting take. We are approaching the hour, so I think we should move on. Thank you, everyone, for the interesting questions. Also, you can obviously reach out to us afterward if you have any pending questions that you come up with later on. We would be happy to respond. But now I will give the floor to Sam to give us some closing remarks. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carolina, and thank you, Klaus and Chiara, for the extremely useful overview presenting the details on what is a common ETS now, still separate but adjacent, as Klaus mentioned. I think there are right now, if you look at the agreement, around 130 pages of amendments to the ETS directive will all be included in one piece of European legislation. And it means the vast majority of Europe's greenhouse gas pollution will be covered by some form of carbon price in the coming years. That is progress because it makes polluting more expensive, and at the same time it will deliver some form of support for the solutions we need to tackle the climate crisis. Is this going to be on its own enough? No, for sure not. We've known for a long time, looking at carbon pricing instruments, carbon markets, that they need complementary policies. They need other measures in place, like, for example, an ETS2 can work hand in hand with strengthened cars and CO2 standards. The ETS1 works hand in hand with renewable energy and energy saving targets, and all those deserve strengthening over time. But I think what you've seen from this assessment is also an important conclusion that progress has been made. If you look, for example, and I did a quick back of the envelope calculation at the difference in the carbon budget between the current ETS1 legislation and the new one, about 2 gigatons of CO2 emissions will be reduced compared to the current legislation between 2021 and 2030. And this is significant, of course, in terms of making progress on Europe's climate targets. But as we also heard, the pace of change is not keeping up with the challenge and how we tackle the climate crisis, not just in Europe, but also at global level. And a lot of the other shortcomings emerge when you scratch below the surface. The exemptions to energy intensive industries. Europe's largest polluters are significant still. There's still potential for member states to dedicate resources from the ETS to continue investments in fossil fuel infrastructure and use. Those things can and should still be changed over time. Also, this devil in the details, which is in the details, will emerge when we look further at implementation, at monitoring the agreed legislation. We are well aware there is still a lot of work to do there. Delegated and implementing acts, works which will go to expert groups chaired by the European Commission. For example, the review of the ETS benchmarks, but also at national level, the establishment of the social climate plans will be very important to make sure that also civil society has a voice and engages in these discussions, which are typically heavily occupied by industry stakeholders. A last word still, beyond the immediate implementation, it's also fair to say that the next trading phase, the one after 2030, in fact, is already starting today. Klaus alluded to the need to update and the process to update Europe's NDC, looking at post-2030 climate targets towards 2035 and 2040. For anybody who thought we are now done with the ETS and reviewing it, those people were mistaken, because more will be needed and more involvement, more emission reductions will be needed over time. There is a cap which is set for now, but in the coming years, policymakers will need to have another look at this to ensure what the ETS is supposed to do, not just delivering cost-efficient emission reductions, but also making sure emissions are reduced to the level required. That will be a challenge still to follow up on. So from Carbon Market Watch, but I also speak on behalf of the ETX consortium, we look forward to continue to engage with everybody involved in these discussions. We look forward to hosting together with Zero more of these ETS talks, where we can look at more details of the agreement or explore other topics. And thanks again, also from my side, Klaus and Chiara, for the excellent presentations.
I second that, Sam. Thank you for closing this session, and thank you so much to Klaus and Chiara for your amazing and very, very interesting presentations. Yeah, this won't be the last ETS talk. We will have many more to come. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and stay tuned because we will have more of these discussions to come. Thank you.